Hey everybody, welcome to Crazy Tech Lab, and it's the big one today because we have the Ryzen 9000 series CPUs which are launching today. In the lab we have the Ryzen 5 9600X and the Ryzen 7 9700X, and we're going to be pairing them against a whole load of other CPUs in the graphs, going all the way back to Intel 12th gen and all the way back to Ryzen 7 5800X3D on socket AM4. So if you do own an older system, you definitely want to check out the graphs later on because there are some very interesting reasons why you might want to consider upgrading. So obviously there's probably lots of you out there with older systems, so that's the goal here today, is not just to give you an idea about how much faster these CPUs are than their predecessors, but also whether or not you should finally upgrade from your aging Intel or AMD socket AM4 platform, which I know a lot of you are hanging onto. And why wouldn't you with CPUs such as the 5800X3D? It was a great CPU. So lots to get through today with the benchmarks, and obviously answering that question about whether or not you should upgrade. We've got great pricing for AMD socket AM5 right now. The DDR5 pricing for memory is a lot lower than it was 2 years ago. We've got cheaper motherboard pricing as well. So everything's kind of looking pretty sweet when it comes to PC upgrades at the moment. So now, talking of pricing, we do finally have numbers for these processors. Now, we don't have the numbers for the Ryzen 9s yet, which are launching next week. So today is all about the Ryzen 5 and the Ryzen 7. But, and there is a big but, the pricing that leaked from Best Buy and Newegg, I believe, last week does seem to tally with the numbers that AMD has given me so far, which is great news because it's cheaper than the Ryzen 7000 series launch pricing. So for example, the Ryzen 5 9600X is going to retail for $279, and that compares to $300 with the predecessor, the Ryzen 5 7600X. Same goes with the Ryzen 7 9700X, that is going to retail for $359, and the 7700X retailed for $400. So that means that if the pricing continues up at that trend and those prices that we saw on Newegg and Best Buy are true, which we think they are because it's true for these two, that means that the Ryzen 9 9900X should retail for $500, which is $50 cheaper than the $549 for the 9900X. And the 9950X is going to retail for $600, which is $100 cheaper, significant amount of cash, than the 7950X. So great news there if those numbers turn out to be true. Remember, the Ryzen 9 figures there aren't official, they are just what leaked last week, but the leaking does seem to tally so far. Now, if you want to know about UK pricing, I have that here as well. So the Ryzen 7 is going to retail for £340 here in the UK, and this one, the Ryzen 5 9600X, is going to retail for £270 here in the UK. So it's great pricing from AMD because obviously everybody wants a bit of extra money in their back pocket at the moment, but especially if you're thinking about upgrading to one of these CPUs. Now, the CPUs that we've got in the graphs range all the way, as I say, from much older Intel and AMD systems, but they do include Ryzen 7000 series and 3D V-Cache models as well. So remains to be seen how they fare against them. Now, test systems and everything like that, we're going to go into a bit more detail later on, but we should talk about the specifications. So the Ryzen 5 9600X, the same cores and threads as its predecessor, the 9600X, 6 cores, 12 threads, a 5.4 GHz peak boost frequency and 38 megabytes of cache. This CPU, as well as the Ryzen 7, is a 65 watt model, and I can tell you now that these things are very power frugal and probably won't need much more than a mid-range air cooler to keep them plenty cool enough. Now, stepping up to the Ryzen 7 9700X, again, same cores and threads as its predecessor. We've got 8 cores and 16 threads, a peak boost frequency of 5.5 GHz, 40 megabytes of cache in total, and we have a 65 watt TDP as well. Now, the Ryzen 9 9900X, same cores and threads as the 7900X at 12 and 24. We've got a peak boost of 5.6 GHz, 76 megabytes of cache, and that one is a 120 watt model, so it's nearly double the wattage of the Ryzen 7 9700X, so a fairly potent monster, that one, that might need some extra cooling, but we'll have to wait till next week to check that out. The Ryzen 9 9950X though, exactly the same cores and threads as we saw last time, at 16 cores, 32 threads, peak boost of 5.7 GHz, 18 megabytes of cache, and that one is 170 watt TDP. So a fair few differences there, but not much compared to the previous generations. So all that remains to be seen is how these things compare against the other models that we've got in the graphs. And as I mentioned, the Ryzen 9s will be out next week, so don't forget to like and comment on this video. Let me know what you think of these two CPUs. Are you going to be upgrading? Are you going to be waiting for the 3D Vcache models? Are you going to wait for the Ryzen 9s? Don't forget to turn on those notifications as well if you do subscribe. Subscribing, liking, and commenting on this video just helps punch me through the algorithm, gets me noticed, and helps keep me doing videos like this, basically. So that's it for the intro. Let's crack on with the review. Moving on to the benchmark results now then, and a quick word on my test system. We have two ASUS motherboards for both of my test systems, Cosmo and Wanda, who you saw earlier. And we have the ASUS ROG Maximus Z790 Hero, catering for the Intel CPUs, and we have the ROG Strix X670EE gaming Wi-Fi, catering for the AMD CPUs, with the exception of the Ryzen 7 5800X3D, which is catered for by the ROG Maximus Impact. So each system has 32 gigabytes of DDR6000 memory with exactly the same timings, and we have an RTX 4090 graphics card powering each of the systems. Both systems are fully water-cooled, so there will be no issues with thermal throttling with the processors, and we have a couple of Kingston 2TB SSDs thrown in there as well for good measure. Both systems use the latest version of Windows 11 with all the updates, and we also use the latest NVIDIA driver, everything up to date as of August 2024. We also used a separate system to test the Ryzen 9 7950X3D, because that one can be a little flaky if you don't use it on a fresh install of Windows. Now, we've included two resolutions today, 1080p and 1440p, for the simple reason that pairing 1080p with an RTX 4090 isn't a realistic scenario, and it can sort of artificially enlarge any CPU bottlenecking that's going on out there. So it's a great way to see where that bottlenecking might take place, with one CPU being unable to deal with the demands of that RTX 4090 compared to another, but realistically you're not going to see those differences in the real world if you pair a mid-range graphics card at 1080p with the same CPU. So we've included 1440p as well in these tests to basically highlight a more realistic scenario. So first off, the Adobe Photoshop Puget Systems benchmark, and AMD is off to a winner here. Both Ryzen 9000 series CPUs sitting ahead of every single other CPU in the graph. AMD does generally have a bit of an advantage here, it seems, with most of the other Ryzen 7000 series sitting above most other CPUs except for the Core i9 14900K. But overall here, it's a really, really good result for the Zen 5 architecture. Next up is Adobe Premiere Pro in the Puget Systems benchmark, and we have the Ryzen 7 9600X and the Ryzen 5 9600X sitting just ahead of their predecessors. So not massive gains here, but it's likely at the top of the graph that we might see the Ryzen 9 9950X when it launches next week come top in this graph, given that the Ryzen 9 7950X is already just behind the top spot. If you're a Davinci Resolve guy rather than Premiere Pro, then this graph is for you, because this is the Puget Systems Davinci Resolve test. And we have, again, the Ryzen 7 9600X and the 9600X just ahead of their predecessors. It's going to need more cores and more threads to get anywhere near the top of this graph. A bit more photo editing on the go here in the UL Procyon benchmark. We have the combined Photoshop and Lightroom test, and here we have the Ryzen 5 9600X and Ryzen 7 9700X, again showing their prowess in photo editing, sitting at the very top of the field. So given that we've got essentially more cores doing better here, the fact that this is on the architecture alone is really, really impressive, and we're hopefully going to see even more impressive things from the Ryzen 9000 series with more cores. Next up is HandBrake, and a simple large video file encode here down to 1080p, and we have both of the CPUs doing slightly better than their predecessors. Obviously we're just relying on the architecture here to do those improvements. There are no increases in core counts or anything like that, which would have probably seen much better performance here. So lower is better, obviously, in this graph. It's the time taken to perform the encode. And obviously, we've got some reasonable results here, but when you look at Intel's CPUs with more cores, such as the Core i5 13600K, that is still outperforming even the Ryzen 7 9700X in this test. Moving on to Cinebench, and we have Cinebench R24 this time rather than the older R23, just because I've moved on to the more modern version of this benchmark, even though it takes a heck of a lot longer to actually complete the test, which is a bit of a pain, but we'll get there eventually with faster and faster CPUs, I guess. And the Ryzen 5 9600X a fair way ahead of the Ryzen 5 7600X, and the Ryzen 7 9700X again a little bit faster than the 7700X. But when it comes to raw multi-threading, I think Intel still has a little bit of an advantage due to its extra cores, for example with the Core i5 13600K. Now, the single core test is often the most important and also the most interesting because it shows the increases in IPC and the benefits of the new architecture, and that's exactly what we're seeing here. So multi-threading aside, extra cores and threads aside, this is how fast every core will actually be. And we see a great result for AMD here. We've got the Ryzen 7 9700X out in front, outscoring the very powerful Core i9 14900K by 1 point, and the Ryzen 5 9600X matching the 14900K. Now, if you compare those results to the Ryzen 7 7700X down in with 119 points, and the 7600X with 118 points, it's clear that Zen 5 offers a significant benefit in terms of IPC and single and lightly threaded performance. It's finally game time here then, and we have CounterStrike 2 up first and at 1080p. Both CPUs perform really, really well. The Ryzen 5 9600X generally outperforming most other mid-range CPUs, such as the Core i5 13600K and the Core i5 14600K, and obviously massively outstripping the Ryzen 7 5800X3D. So owners of that CPU might want to consider upgrading. And the Ryzen 7 9700X generally outperforming or matching every other CPU in the graph except for the two 3D Vcache models at the top there. So a very good result for the 9700X, but the older 3D Vcache models are still faster. Now moving on to 1440p, and we have a much better result for the new Ryzen 9000 series CPUs because both of them sit just below the older 3D Vcache models. So they outstrip every single other CPU in the graph in terms of the minimum 99th percentile frame rate. If not the average frame rates, there were a couple of CPUs that were slightly faster there, such as the Core i9 13900K and the 14900K. But overall, it's a great result at 1440p for the two Ryzen 9000 series CPUs. Our next game test is Assassin's Creed Mirage, and here we have somewhat mid-table results for both Ryzen 9000 series CPUs, the best result being at 1080p with the Ryzen 7 9700X, where it managed to beat the Ryzen 9 7900X, the Core i5 14600K, and indeed the Ryzen 9 7950X3D, which seemed to struggle in this test compared to the other 3D Vcache chip, the 7800X3D, which came top by quite a long way and outstripping the Ryzen 7 9700X. Now the Ryzen 5 9600X doing reasonably well, and as you'd expect, offering a little bit of extra performance over the Ryzen 5 9600X, but generally there's less of a benefit here with the Zen 5 architecture. And moving on to 1440p, similar result, the Ryzen 7 9700X still outperforming the Core i5 14600K, and actually coming very close to matching the Ryzen 9 7950X and the 7950X3D again, and the 7800X3D just a little bit out in front with the Core i9 14900K sitting at the top of the graph. Moving on to Cyberpunk now then, and with a bit of extra spice thanks to ray tracing and DLSS being enabled, the Ryzen 7 9700X performing very, very well in this test and coming second only to the two 3D Vcache models, the 7950X3D and the 7800 X3D. The Ryzen 5 9600X not performing quite as well, slightly higher average frame rate than the Ryzen 5 7600X, but a slightly lower minimum 99th percentile. So not quite sure what's going on down at the bottom there, although it did still beat the Core i5 13600K. Stepping up to 1440p, and again it's a very similar result. We have the Ryzen 7 9700X actually splitting the two 3D Vcache models this time thanks to its higher minimum 99th percentile than the Ryzen 7 7800X3D. The Ryzen 9 7950X3D just ahead on the minimum 99th percentile. So going further down the graph, the Ryzen 5 9600X stepping up a little bit in the graph and outperforming the Ryzen 5 7600X by a couple of frames in this test, but generally there doesn't seem to be that much difference between the two CPUs here, although they do still beat the Core i5 14600K. Moving on to our final game test then, and it's Microsoft Flight Simulator, which can be a bit of a tricky and inconsistent benchmark to run, but I think the results here definitely make sense. So we've got the Ryzen 7 9700X up first, and that outperformed every single other CPU in the graphs, except for the Core i9 14900K and the 7800X3D way out in front. The 7950X3D generally not performing as I might expect it to in this test. It still outperforms the standard model without 3D V-Cache, but it's not getting anywhere near the likes of what the 7800X3D managed, so not quite sure what's going on there. The system was set up exactly for it. It's done really well in other tests, just not in Flight Simulator, for example. So the Ryzen 5 9600X actually posting a slightly higher average frame rate than the 9700X, but again, this game can be a little inconsistent at times, but generally the more results you get, and I got multiple readings for each result here in the game, of course, generally it paints a somewhat a clearer picture. Now, the surprise result here, though, was the Ryzen 7 5800X3D. That 3D V-Cache really making a difference because that CPU still holding its own here, although the Ryzen 5 9600X was much faster. And at 1080p at least. Moving on to 1440p though, and we have an absolutely stunning result for the Ryzen 7 5800X3D, just way up there in the graphs, and closely matching the Ryzen 7 9700X. So that 3D V-Cache obviously doing wonders for Flight Simulator. The 7800X3D, again, that's miles out in front in this game. Again though, the 7950X3D struggling in this test. The Ryzen 5 9600X, though, generally outperforming most other CPUs in its price range. Now, we've seen some pretty awesome results from the Ryzen 9000 series here today then, but what was equally impressive was the fact that they did all this while drawing much less power than nearly every single other CPU in the graphs. Now, the Ryzen 5 9600X, for example, in Cinebench R24 drew just 181 watts from the wall, and that compares to 219 watts for the Ryzen 5 7600X, so nearly 40 watts less power used there, and 60 watts less than the Ryzen 7 7700X. And if we step up to some of the mid-range Intel CPUs, such as the Core i5 14600K, you're looking at 323 watts from the wall. That's nearly 150 watts more. So significant power savings with these CPUs. They're very, very efficient thanks to the Zen 5 architecture, and the Ryzen, even the Ryzen 7 9700X, not topping 55 degrees with my water cooling, that is, but obviously a decent air cooler is still going to do a great job with these CPUs. And this is out of the box. I've not done any tweaking at all, and as we know, the Ryzen 7000 series generally getting pretty hot under the collar when it comes to cooling, even with water cooling. So it bodes really, really well for these CPUs thanks to the lower power draws and also the improved thermal contact between the heat spreader and the CPU that the new Ryzen 9000 series has. They're hopefully going to be a lot easier to cool with modest air cooling. So what do we think of AMD's Ryzen 9000 series with their Zen 5 architecture then? Well, I think the Zen 5 architecture has given us some incredible CPUs here today. I think these two are probably the CPUs that I would be most excited to own myself, probably for quite a while. The Ryzen 7000 series was okay at launch, but the Ryzen 5, the 7600X, was probably the weakest by far out of that lot. This time, the Ryzen 5 9600X performs really, really well, is incredibly power frugal, easy to cool, and is even cheaper than the 7600X, which is great news. The Ryzen 7 9700X does have a bit of the 3D V-Cache cloud hanging over it, because we are expecting 9000 series 3D V-Cache models to appear in the next couple of months. When, we don't know, but they're probably going to be a lot more expensive as well. So if you're not too concerned about gaming, you're more of a casual gamer, then this CPU is probably all you need, but it's not quite a run out and buy it now recommendation that I would recommend if you're looking for the cheapest option, which is the Ryzen 5 9600X. This one would make a fantastic upgrade if you've got an older Ryzen mid-range CPU from the 5, 3, 2 and 1000 series, so older socket AM4 models. It might struggle to keep up with some of the 16-core models in multi-threaded workloads, but in games this thing is going to better everything except something maybe with 3D V-Cache. So That's my top recommendation today, is to go out and buy this one. With the Ryzen 7 9700X, it's more of a case of whether or not you need the extra frame rates, etc, etc, and are prepared to pay more for a 3D V-Cache model. The 7800X 3D, obviously slower than this one outside of games, but faster in some games thanks to its 3D V-Cache than the 9700X. So that's always going to be a bit of a question with AMD. It's almost like, well, it is competing against itself with the 3D V-Cache models, because you've got this one launching now, but everybody's going to be waiting for the 3D V-Cache model, right? So, and the trouble with the Ryzen 7 9700X is that, as we saw with the Ryzen 7000 series, there's a much, much narrower gap outside of games in terms of performance than we saw with the 5800X 3D. With that one, they stuck the cache on the top. It was quite hot running. They had to drastically reduce the frequencies to rein in those thermals, and that meant that outside of games, it didn't perform very well at all, as you can see in the graphs that we looked at today. With the 7000 series, they managed to narrow that gap significantly, so there wasn't that much difference. There was still a difference, but not that much. So what we're going to see with the Ryzen 9000 series is anybody's guess, and it's getting to the point now where it's almost pointless them releasing a standard model, because the 3D V-Cache model is always going to perform nearly as well outside of games and significantly better in them. So yeah, I mean, for me, this is probably the CPU that I would go for, just because I'd like to have the extra multi-threaded performance. But it's also the CPU that you will probably want to hold off buying, just to see how much maybe the 7800X 3D drops, and how much the 9000 series X3D processors cost as well. But in general, both of these CPUs, super efficient, very low power requirements, very low cooler requirements as well, and generally excellent performance in games and especially in content creation. So that's it from me today. Don't forget to like and comment down below. Love hearing what you guys think of AMD's Ryzen 9000 series. Are you upgrading from an older system? Are you going to be upgrading from Intel or AMD to one of these? Are you racing for the Ryzen 9000 series, which are out next week? Love hearing what you guys think of in the comments down below. And liking and commenting just helps punch me through the algorithm and gets me noticed. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on those notifications so you're notified of future reviews, including the Ryzen 9 9900X and 9950X, which are out next week. So thanks to AMD for sending these two over, and that's it from me today. Hope you enjoyed the show. Tune back in very, very soon. Got lots more cool videos, and we'll be back very, very soon. Thanks for watching.